Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to their DriveThruRPG review, my written and video view series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at DriveThruRPG.com. This video will be reviewing the Tier 1 Dungeon Crawl Tomb of the Twilight Queen, designed by MT Black for Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. I reviewed several of Black's supplements and material. Not a whole lot of D&D adventures though yet. And there's a very certain style that the designer uses, which is kind of like pocketbook, black and white. Almost looks like it would be part of like a magazine or like literally one of those smaller, said pocketbook. That basically doesn't have a whole lot of art or doesn't have any color whatsoever, which is what we're going to get here. However, on the plus side, which I always prefer to have, the nice, glossy, beautiful, looks like it's a full, official hardcover book. But on the plus side, this is extremely well organized. It's very well written. One of the most straightforward, easy to read, easy to parse adventures that I've reviewed in a very long time. It's got large font. The actual word ratio to page ratio is very brief, which makes it easy to read because there's not a whole lot of having to search around different paragraphs and things. There are so many subheadings. Every single room in this dungeon has features and monsters and tactics and treasures and traps and lore, and it all is identified, in those very big headings. It just makes it so easy to be able to read and understand how to run it, more so than many adventures that I've reviewed. So that is a huge plus, and to me that more than makes up for the fact that it's a style that I'm not necessarily too fond of, but I can see why the designer chooses to write like this, to design it, to lay it out like this, because it ends up being phenomenally well organized. This is an adventure designed for level 3, and it can scale from from level 1 through 4 with the average party level adjustments for all the different encounters. It's a good adventure. Well, it's a great dungeon crawl. The actual adventure basically is just the dungeon crawl, which means that there's no the beginning is the weakest. There's no real adventure hook. There's no real the quest giving NPC is just kind of all hand waved. It's like, hey, somebody wants to hire you to go basically loot this tomb, and you're going to travel over there into this desert region that's ostensibly part of the designer's homebrew world, but obviously you can just kind of put it anywhere if you want to kind of, classic like the Mummy or Egyptian themed tomb raiding, dungeon crawl. But there's not really a overarching narrative story, I guess. Because there's no real adventure hook in terms of like, oh, we need this magic plant to save our dying child or something. There's no, even the usual suspects aren't even present here. It's just, no, we need to go loot. There's a certain book I'm looking for. Yeah, I think it's in this tomb. Let's go get it. So that part's kind of hand waved over, which does mean that this one makes a very easy to run one-shot adventure because you don't have a lot of that extra baggage in terms of the storytelling. However, it would have been nice to at least have those kind of, options in there in case people wanted to create more of a narrative structure and maybe integrate that into their existing campaign. So once we get past the basically pretty weak first chapter and we get into the actual dungeon crawl, it is phenomenal. This is an amazingly awesome dungeon design. Even if you're not going to run this dungeon, you could take a lot of inspiration and ideas from the actual rooms that are used here, which is also the mark of a really great dungeon design. Even if I'm which I would be tempted to even run this as is because I think it's really well designed, but even if you're not, you could just take pieces of it and slot them into your own dungeon and kind of modify things around. And I think it would be a really cool way to build a dungeon. It does the cool thing where at the beginning is, there's a bunch of bandits camped out at the entrance who obviously haven't figured out how to make it deeper into the dungeon. So you've got kind of an initial little, bandit encounter where there's a cute part where there's one of them is drank a potion of invisibility and tries to be a ghost of the tomb, trying to scare the players away. And then once they actually make it past the secret entrance, then it starts getting really interesting with a lot of, an actual ghost appears and tells them to, ward them off. There's a really cool, like, there's 2 different shafts that are used very effectively. One of them is a little 4-foot, in fact, I think there's a depiction of it here. Yeah, here we go. When you make it down this corridor, there's just a hole in the ground, and you're supposed to just fucking drop down this hole, which is a 4-foot diameter. That's not necessarily like super teeny tiny, like that one video you've probably seen of that dude that's like, scrunches up and squeezes down and sets off everybody's phobias. But still, it's a very uncomfortable, and it's a permanent darkness spell 60 feet down into the next actual corridor. And it's kind of cool stuff like that, where it's not, there are a lot of traps and puzzles, but it's also just some interesting ways that you have to get around stuff and really just leave it up to your players to figure out, well, how do I get across this thing, or how do I go down this way, or anything like that. It's just, it does such a great job of fulfilling the exploration pillar of D&D, which is really, you could argue, is anything that's not combat or dialogue, like socializing and role-playing with folks, then it's all exploration. And that's what this one really focuses and doubles down hard on, is traps, puzzles, and just dealing with the environment. I should scroll through and actually show you, but it's easier for me to stare at the map, because unfortunately it's the only screen the map is on. Now, we do only get this one black and white, obviously grid graph paper style map that doesn't have any real art or details on it. That's a bummer. It's basically very that kind of Dyson Logos style. I actually didn't think if this is actually a Dyson Logos map or not. That's not at all what I like. I hate to see that. It does technically fit with the style of this product, which is, lack of color, not a whole lot of art, pretty simple in terms of that. But it definitely deflates my interest in running a dungeon whenever I don't get that cool dungeon map, especially if your entire adventure is literally just the dungeon crawl. That's what you've got. Then having a great dungeon map means a lot, whereas this one is a bummer. So that's unfortunate. But the actual design is awesome. There's a sphere in room number 7 that's an anti-gravity room. That's kind of a glowing sphere that if you get near it, you start taking damage, and as you're in that room for longer, these shadows start appearing on the wall from the fiery sphere, and they eventually become actual shadows that attack you in this cool, like, anti-gravity room, which is such a neat, like, concept for an encounter. And the idea is you're supposed to get up close and touch the sphere, and then you teleport to, like, the next stage of the dungeon, which has a classic, like, false treasure room behind bars, and the bars deal damage to you. There's a really awesome, room where they make mummies, whatever that room is called, like embalming or something. And there's a mummy on the table, and you think, oh, of course, this mummy is going to spring up and attack us. That is not what happens. Instead, you describe the room. You describe, the mummy on the table, the organs in the jars. There's this big vat of black liquid over the mummy itself, and you're thinking, okay, those are all the organs, and we're making sure to stay clear of the mummy. And what actually happens is you get anywhere close to the mummy to start, poking around and inspecting it, or, smash it with a hammer or whatever you want to be sure. And the vat of liquid pours down, and it's a black pudding. So it's a whole fake out. It's not, the mummy isn't actually the monster. It's the black pudding up in the vial. And then there's a brain in a jar that's like that's saying creepy shit to people until they smash the brain. It's not really a monster or anything, but that kind of thing is really cool and just a neat little twist. This room 12 has a bunch of statues which start bleeding as you're walking through the room, which is really creepy and cool. You don't even know what's going on or how to deal with that. I mean, first of all, you just see these rooms and you just know, like, fucked up shit's gonna happen, right? You just have a room full of statues. Like, well, these statues are gonna come to life. They're gonna shoot laser beams out of their eyes. Like, something's gonna happen. It's hard not to, like, metagame this stuff, which is why I like seeing those things being used. Those classic elements of, oh, it's the pit trap. Oh, it's the the mummy on the table or something, and then you twist it and do it something that the players wouldn't expect. In this case, the statues start bleeding. You're like, okay, what's going on with there? I'm staying away from these statues. And a bunch of bloody skeletons pop out. They're weakened. They only have like a couple of hit points and only a short sword, but there could be 30 of them potentially. Just all start springing out and attacking the party member, which is awesome. There's a cool kind of puzzle trap in area 13 that's got a bunch of these statues and a bell in the middle. So the idea is somebody's supposed to walk over to a statue, and then you ring the bell, and then something happens. Basically, bad things happen at most of them, where the arms like come out and grab you, or this wall of force comes out and cages you in. And then the fourth one actually reveals the passageway to the next area. There is a very classic mummy in a sarcophagus, so we do check that box, which thankfully the designer includes about halfway through. Design notes that were, how they were inspired to make this dungeon, and the different, tropes and things they wanted to use and things they wanted to avoid. And they basically said, like, yeah, I definitely wanted to use the mummy in the sarcophagus thing, but not, the early one, which was the obvious choice, but certainly have a mummy pop out of a sarcophagus at some point, which I very much appreciate. And of course, there's treasure to be found in all of these things. I love in room 15, there's just a vertical shaft, another use of a shaft, but this one's a large one with a chain hanging in the middle about 7 feet from the ledge. and you have to just get onto the chain and then climb down, and then you make it, you know, whatever, 40-foot drop down until you get to the next corridor. Well, the chain is like electrified, so if you fucking touch the chain with your bare hands, you start taking lightning damage every round, which again is a cool way of doing a normal exploration thing, and then adding just a little bit of a challenge on there for players to be like, oh, the first guy gets on there, okay, are you wearing gloves, or how are we going to actually do this, or do we just drop down and take the bludgeoning damage when we fall? Cool ideas. Room 16 has a treasure room with a rope. If you pull the rope once, gold coins fall down. That's good. You pull the rope twice, more gold coins fall down. Oh, we're going to pull this rope again and going to keep giving. No, the third time, a bunch of gold scarabs that come down as swarms of insects and combat occurs. Absolutely delightful. In room 7, or in the next doorway, which is right before this penultimate room, a ghostly figure appears that basically says, congratulations, you've made it this far into the dungeon. Please give me your name so I can include it on the Hall of Records, blah, blah, blah. And the idea is, if the players are actually naive or, you know, foolish enough to actually give their names to this ghostly apparition, that gives the final boss another move, because she's an onomancer. She's good at cursing people if she knows their names, and so she gets this extra feature attack that like knocks people prone and prevents them from moving if she knows their real name. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Room 18 has a statue with two mouths, and they're like muffled, like chanting or something, and then there's two figures stuck in these demi-planes that can't interact with anybody. What a cool, I'm just going to read you this description, actually. It's such a cool room. This is room number 18. Alcoves. In each alcove is a thin silvery screen, which is a window into a tiny demi-plane. Through each screen can be seen a backrog, which is the designer's homebrew, like lizard folk race that kind of makes up this area. Floating in a gray void, one male and the other female. Both creatures are alive and can also see the party. The female in the south alcove frantically gestures towards the statue, while the male silently roars at the party. Silvery screens are cold to the touch, cannot be moved, and are immune to all damage. That's just a neat setup. Like, there's a statue in the middle of the room. It's chanting things, and clearly it's like keeping these creatures like prisoners or something. And if the players decide to either muffle the statue in some way or destroy it, then that releases the prisoners. The one male is a berserker and just immediately attacks the party, but the female, if they know the language, which there is a classic NPC, in this case very similar to Orvex from Tomb of Annihilation, who can, you know, accompany the players and translate, you know, she'll explain that she was just, you know, tried to rise up against the queen and was destroyed because the queen knows the name, and she will tease the players like, don't give the queen your name, which I love the idea. Hopefully the players already did do that, and then they get the message from her saying, oh no, don't do that. I love that little twist. The penultimate room is another great, like, I just picture such great, like, Tomb Raider video games or dungeon crawls or something. There's platforms in the middle above about 20 feet above this mist-covered floor that you can't see the bottom of, so you know something bad's down there. And you're trying to hop across these platforms. Meanwhile, there's a statue on the backside just shooting laser beams at you the whole damn time that you have to roll dex saves for. And if you fall down at the bottom, there's a ghast down there who's got a ring of jumping who can just kind of leap. I think, in case players don't ever fall down, it can like leap up and jump and come at them. But either way, you could, you know, end up separating the party a bit, take some damage from falling, and then have a ghast down there ready to eat them, which is awesome. Once you finally make it to the actual snake statue, you can shut it off, open the door, and then you enter the Queen's Chambers. And the Queen's Chambers has another great room where it's a giant octagonal pit, and then floating above this pit is the sarcophagus. And of course, as soon as you enter the room, the queen appears, which she is just a ghost. And there are no custom stat blocks here, which is interesting. It's just makes use of not a whole lot of monster encounters in general, but a lot of, you know, just black pudding, mummy, bandit stat blocks at the beginning. The swarms of insects, and then the final boss is just a ghost. However, she does have a extra ability. If anybody gave her name, she can use this cruel appellation ability to cause them to go prone and reduce their speed to 0 as kind of a way to command them, essentially. I love that we get tactics breakdown of certain fights. I think there's only in 2 of the fights we really see that, because there's not a whole lot of really big combat encounters. In fact, the bandit fight early is probably the biggest one. Otherwise, it's just kind of one enemy, a simple enemy, you know, that can appear later on. But then the final boss, you know, epic climactic encounter does involve certain tactics, and I really appreciate when designers put that together. In this case, the first round, she uses her horrifying visage to scare people away. The second round, she summons up her servant, which is a skeletal snake, not a bone naga, but just a giant constrictor snake, which is undead, which I think is pretty cool and creepy. And then the servant who has been, you know, scaring you off this whole time appears as a specter. They can both attack the party, which excellent. This is only level 3, so I don't expect like a huge amount of craziness, but I do appreciate a boss that has minions. That is always very, very important because of the action economy. And then, of course, if she actually survives to the 3rd round, she will use her possession. And keep in mind, she's just floating above this thing. Now, if you want to have her come in and attack, she'd have to get within melee, but otherwise she can just sit back there and command her allies. So really, really neat. Full of treasure. It's got enemies that have treasure on them. That's got puzzles and traps galore. Just absolutely fantastic dungeon crawl. As an adventure, it definitely is lacking. There's not a good like overarching story. There's not really a lot of, and like there's one NPC who accompanies you, but he's a non-factor the whole time. I think his whole purpose there is just to translate the ancient writings, and otherwise he's got no, there's no story to tell. There's nothing really like that. It really is just a very classic dungeon crawl, but it's a really, really good one, honestly. It's a really well-designed dungeon, just from a pure, like, Tomb of Horrors, Death Trap style dungeon, but it's level 3, it's not, and you could take all these numbers and scale them up and make it a level 5 dungeon if you wanted to, you just have to slightly, change the damage, change the saves, maybe, increase some enemies, and it does suggest, hey, if you've got, I believe the adjustment for encounters is levels 1 through 4, but even then you could probably go higher because the dungeon, I think, is so, moddable, really. You could change the numbers around and easily make it a little more challenging for the player. So from a pure dungeon crawling standpoint, I think it's absolutely phenomenal. As an adventure, I think it's a little bit lacking. Let's go over my pros and cons for Tomb of the Twilight Queen. It's extremely well organized and laid out. Each room includes features, monsters, treasures, tactics, secrets, and lore. I kind of skimmed over. I didn't really, I spent a long time looking at this one page, but if you look at all of the individual dungeon rooms, each room has a feature. Usually you get the feature at the beginning of the dungeon, which says, hey, there's no lighting, and there's, here's what the wall situation's like and all that. Instead, this one literally has every single room has different features because every room has some kind of detail about it. And I love how the designer almost uses like a keyword system that you would see in like, video games where you can like, hover over as a tooltip or something and it pops up. It's almost like that, where it's, features and, the floor marked X on the map is a trap, and you go down to trap, and that explains what the trap is, and it'll say here's the monster. Or in the case of treasure, it'll list whatever treasures are included there, and maybe some lore that you can find, written on the walls. They'll be under its own section called lore. It's just such a well organized document. I don't know if I've ever seen an adventure of anything that was this well organized in terms of how easy it is to figure out what's going on in every single room, how the rooms are connected, and what is the information that I, the DM, need to know in order to run this as efficiently and easily as possible. And it's just phenomenal. Pro, straightforward, easy to run dungeon crawl. I kind of separated that into 2 pros, but that basically one leads into the other because it's so well organized. The dungeon crawl itself becomes very, very easy to run. This is if you are a newcomer like DM, or maybe even a first time DM, and you don't want to worry about a bunch of role playing and dialogue and storytelling, but you just want a classic D&D dungeon crawl, this one will be a really great one to recommend because it is so well organized, and I think it's relatively simple to run from the DM's point of view. Pros, interesting puzzles, traps, and lore. It absolutely excels at the exploration pillar of D&D. It still has combat. There's plenty of combat encounters. There's a mummy that pops out. There's the bandits at the beginning. Possible swarms of insects. You could free a berserker from there. There's the final fight. Not too many that I think it would slow it down. And the overall dungeon crawl, I think it'd be hard pressed to. You might be able to do it in a one shot, especially because there's no real before and after. So it's really just the dungeon crawl. I bet you could do this as a one shot, even if you hit all the different combat encounters. But especially with the exploration pillar, which is usually the hardest one to do in D&D, this one does a phenomenal job showcasing like, hey, here's what a dungeon looks like when it really doubles down hard on puzzles and lore and traps and just trying to get around the environment of the dungeon itself. And final pro, encounter adjustments for levels 1 through 4. There's not a whole lot of actual combat encounters, but the ones that are there is very moddable because you can easily switch the numbers around, increase hit points, decrease hit points, and I really appreciate whenever the designer includes those kind of notes. Cons, it lacks adventure hooks and meaningful events before the dungeon. Basically, my way of saying there's no real story here, and I'm almost okay with that. The one thing I'm bummed about is that at the beginning, it doesn't even really try to bring the characters here, other than it's like, hey, there's this NPC that hires you, wants to get a book in here, you're going to go with him and escort him. There's no, like, I don't know, role-playing notes in this character. There's no real evolution of character growth, nothing in that regard, and there's no, other kind of adventure hooks or ways to integrate. None of that is there. It's just this dungeon crawl trying to get there as soon as possible, which I love the dungeon crawl, but it's a shame that not enough attention was paid to the overarching narrative surrounding it. And the other con is the map. Again, I think the style actually works fine. It's not necessarily a style I like, but the overall style works really well, and it makes it easy to read. But on the flip side, that means the map ends up being just a plain black and white graph paper map design, which is just crushing for somebody that really loves, somebody like me who runs primarily through Roll20, and maps mean a lot. And especially, dungeon crawling and maps go hand in hand, and having a map look like this is very deflating in an otherwise excellent dungeon design. Final verdict, with clever traps and an immaculately organized style, Tomb of the Twilight Queen is a classic dungeon crawl in all the right ways. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Christopher, Thomas, Captain Mike, Adam, Stan, Nathan, Alex, Cam, and William, and Jonathan. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Aras, Limpius Buds, Jerome, Scalenia, Nick, Farty Mc, Butterpants, Blood Angel, Vronis, Baboon, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, and James. Thank you all very much for your support.